So we're going to look at fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance in these next couple of videos. We'll start out with fluid. We're wet. As organisms, mammals have a lot of water. Babies are nice and dewy. They have 73% water. Men tend to be about 60% water, and women about 50% water. They have a higher fat content, just subcutaneous and breasts, etc. As we age, we dry out, just like an apple doll. We decline to about 45% water, which can be quite significant. The water, about 40 liters of water in the average person, it's 2/3 inside the cells. It is really the cytoplasm of the cells. All the cells are filled with cytoplasm, and that is primarily water. So about 25 liters, 2/3 of it. Extracellularly, there is about 15 liters, 1/3 of the water. Blood plasma is about 3 liters because we have about 5 liters of blood. Interstitial fluid is 12 liters. And between those two things, they make up most of the extracellular fluid. But there's a few other places where we have fluid, like synovial fluid, serous fluid in between the visceral and parietal serous membranes, like the pleura, etc. GI secretions, lymph, which is really a lot like interstitial fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, the humors in the eye, vitreous and aqueous humor in the eye, all make up a little bit. But in total, that probably wouldn't even come up with half a liter. So it's primarily, it's mostly interstitial fluid. So if we look at this on a graph, on a table that looks like this, extracellular is this bit, mostly blood, plasma, and interstitial fluid. The intracellular is cytoplasm. So water is a very good solvent. It is a polar solvent, so any polar molecules will dissolve in it. The solutes that can be either electrolytes or non-electrolytes. Non-electrolytes don't dissociate. So this would be things like sugars, creatinine, urea, nitrogenous compounds, things like that, amino acids. The electrolytes are salts, acids, and bases. They do dissociate when they dissolve in water. So NaCl, sodium chloride, becomes sodium and chlorine. They come apart. Most of the solutes are electrolytes. Remember when we talked about osmosis, osmosis is the number of particles on one side versus the number of particles on the other that have dissolved. One molecule of sodium chloride, therefore, when it dissociates, is two things, and they're both fairly light, but they are two things, and they have double the osmotic potential of one molecule of, say, glucose, which is far heavier. It takes up more space, and so and doesn't dissociate, so it's only one thing. So the osmotic capability of the electrolytes are fairly great. Although we're going to see that proteins and non-electrolytes have a fair amount of osmotic potential as well. I'm not going to worry about this. This gets complicated, but we talk about the concentration of electrolytes in milliequivalents. So that's the electrical charges per liter of solution. So rather than percentage, because different ions weigh different amounts. So for a singly charged ion, like sodium, 1 milliequivalent is 1 milliosmol. So it causes the amount of osmolarity. If there's a double cation, like calcium, you get a half a milliosmol for 1 milliequivalent. So because the milliequivalent is the charge, and there's twice as much charge per molecule, so that means there's half as many molecules, so it causes half the osmosis. So these electrolytes are not evenly distributed. Because of things like the sodium-potassium pump and the calcium pump, the various active transport pumps, we can move these things around, and we do. So the extracellular compartment, the extracellular fluid, the major cation is sodium and the major anion is chlorine, so sodium chloride. This is the same, and it's the same concentration whether we're talking blood plasma or extracellular fluid. The blood plasma has more proteins, however. Intracellularly, it's potassium and HPO4 is the anion, which is phosphate, right? It's the PO4 is the P in ATP and ADP. So HPO4 phosphate ions are the major anion inside the cell. The major cation is sodium, and or it is potassium. When you think about it, the sodium-potassium pump pumps the potassium out or the potassium in and the sodium out. Therefore, you end up with all this potassium in. So phospholipids, proteins are really the dissolved solutes. And you're going to see that intracellularly, in the cell, there's a huge number of these things, proteins and phospholipids primarily, 97%. Blood plasma has 90%, interstitial fluid has only 60% of these things, way more relying on the electrolytes. So this is a little chart looking at the relative amounts. Look, what I want you to get out of this is sodium levels are high in extracellular fluid, so blood, interstitial fluid, and it's low intracellularly. Potassium is the exact opposite because of the sodium-potassium pump. Calcium is primarily outside of the cell, blood, and even though there's not much calcium, and look, it's virtually non-existent in the cell. Magnesium is the opposite. HCO3, which is a bicarbonate, is high outside and still relatively high inside. And this is when we take CO2, carbon dioxide, and we mix it with H2O, we get H2CO3, which dissociates, which is carbonic acid, and that dissociates into HCO3, bicarbonate, and hydrogen ions. And because the cells are making the carbon dioxide in Krebs cycle and in the mitochondria, in cellular respiration, it's still fairly high in there. But it follows a concentration gradient and ends up interstitially and then in the blood. Chlorine levels go with the sodium. Phosphate levels go with the potassium. SO4 and proteins, you'll notice that the proteins are very low in the interstitial fluid. So having the right amount of fluid in the right compartments matters. And it's regulated by two opposing forces. First force is osmosis, and the second force is hydrostatic pressure. And hydrostatic pressure is just the pressure of the presence of the liquid. Hydrostatic pressure is what makes a coffee filter work, the weight of the water going through the filter. Hydrostatic pressure is what is blood pressure if we're talking inside blood vessels. Hydrostatic pressure is the pressure on the interstitial fluid, which is can be raised by massage or by wearing support hose or tight stockings, things like that. Osmosis, you understand already. Osmosis is things move according to the osmolality, and because water moves fairly freely, it equals out. It reaches an equilibrium fairly quickly. But water moves from the direction of the more dilute to the more concentrated. So we dilute the concentrated and we concentrate the dilute. And osmosis flows both ways. Ions move primarily by active transport or by channels with facilitated diffusion, depending on which way they're going. If we're letting sodium into the cell, facilitated diffusion. If we're putting it out, active transport with sodium-potassium bond. So by changing the concentration of solutes in any one of these compartments, water will chase that by osmosis. I'm not so worried about this one. So where does the water come from and where does it go? So they should balance out. Most days they do balance out. And it's about 2.5 liters a day. You get water by drinking, by eating, because most food is cellular and therefore there is intracellular fluid. You get actually a surprising amount of water from the cytoplasm of the cells of the food that we eat. And we also make water. Water is a byproduct of dehydration synthesis. So as we make peptide bonds in creating proteins, a water molecule is created and it adds to the water intake. We lose water through our breath, through perspiration, through urinating, and through feces. Anybody whose feces are too dry know how hard it is to pass them. So we're going to lose water in those three ways. So this is kind of an average of things. So 60% of the water is from stuff we drink, 30% is from what we eat, and 10% is what we make. We lose 4% in feces, 8% in sweat. Insensible losses through breathing, but 28%, and we lost 60% through urination. If water intake is down, then urine output also goes down, and we find this balance. If water input goes up, so say you're taking 3.5 liters of water in, and urine levels will go up probably to 2,500 mils. Finds this balance. The homeostasis of this is very, very important. So intake, we regulate the intake side of this by being thirsty. And I'm sorry, and there are thirst centers in your hypothalamus, in your brain. If plasma osmolality goes down, then what happens is that you feel thirsty, you drink water, and you change that. If you have less blood, you will have less blood pressure. The baroreceptors will monitor that and trigger a thirst response. Angiotensin 2, which is trying to raise your blood pressure, will also make you thirsty. Dry mouth is the thing that reaches our consciousness. It's like, my mouth is dry, I'm going to take a drink. So anything that causes you to lose blood volume or blood pressure, which is really related to this, will make you thirsty. A lot of people that have been in car accidents and have desanguinated, lost a lot of blood, their main complaint is thirst. People that are having like sunstroke get very thirsty. People with gunshot wounds often complain more about the thirst than the pain. Thirst is a big deal. Now, what's interesting though is that if we drink water until blood pressure raises again, or blood volume raises, osmolality changes, we're going to drink too much because there's a time lag between drinking it and the effect. So this is where the dry mouth comes in. As soon as your mouth no longer feels dry, it inhibits thirst. So you relieve the dry mouth. Activation of stretch receptors in the stomach also inhibit that. So a lot of times people mistake being thirsty with being hungry, because if they eat, it inhibits their feeling. So there are people that have trouble where they are a little bit dehydrated, but they interpret that as being hungry. So this prevents us from overcorrecting, because if you drank water until your blood pressure was raised, you would have so much water in your stomach that then the blood pressure would go up and up and up and up and overshoot the mark. So we drink a little bit, we don't feel thirsty, the blood pressure raises a little bit but not enough, so we get thirsty again, so we drink a little bit more, etc. And we've kind of fine-tuned it. So this is just that idea in chart form. Okay, we can regulate water output. We can't regulate it all because we will always have the insensible water loss, breathing. We need to have water loss in feces, and we have to pee at least 500 mils to get rid of waste. The rest of it is variable. Body water and sodium content are regulated together, and it's all about blood pressure. And really the function of the cardiovascular system, but it's blood pressure. And it is hormonally controlled. So we're going to talk about the hormones. The first hormone is antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is just what it sounds like. Anti, against, dia, through, urine. So against passing urine. So when antidiuretic hormone levels are low, you make lots of dilute urine and you lose the volume of fluids in the body. When antidiuretic hormone is high, you make concentrated urine. You pee less because antidiuretic hormone is high. And therefore you retain the volume of fluids in the body. The way that a lot of people can relate to this is antidiuretic hormone release is inhibited by drinking alcohol. So you go and have a couple of beers, and you know what they say, if it's clear, it's beer. You end up peeing a lot, like you're going for a pee once a beer, and it is very dilute beer because you don't have antidiuretic hormone. You lower your body fluids, and what's interesting, that makes you thirsty, and since you're drinking beer, it makes you want to drink more beer, which exacerbates the problem. You go home, you go to bed, and then you wake up the next day dehydrated. You're thirsty, your head is pounding because your cardiac output has to make up for a lack of blood volume. You're nauseated because you shunt blood away from your digestive system and you don't process food because you don't have any excess blood to do that. And you're terribly thirsty. And you probably are in an electrolyte imbalance as well. You will be producing huge amounts of antidiuretic hormone when you're hungover like that, because you want to concentrate the urine and get as much water, save as much water as you can. So the hypothalamus osmoreceptors trigger or inhibit the antidiuretic hormone release. And this is the same centers or similar centers to the thirst centers. So changes in blood volume, blood pressure, if you've been sweating a lot, if you've been vomiting, if you burn yourself and there is a lot of interstitial fluid goes into the blisters, this will trigger antidiuretic hormone release. So just you can follow this along. The antidiuretic hormone comes from the posterior pituitary, as we learned last semester. It makes the collecting ducts and the distal convoluted tubule of the kidneys open the aquaporin tubes and reabsorb more water. Reabsorbing more water makes less urine, but increases the plasma volume and changes the osmolarity. I'm not worried about disorders, but it's interesting. Dehydration is a loss of water, and hypotonic hydration is when there's plenty of water but not enough sodium. Edema is too much water in the interstitium. So in the next video we will talk about electrolyte balance.